see Jimmy and Percy together, they have the same face, but it's Mutt and Jeff. You know, Percy is so tall, and Jimmy was known as Little Bird because he's short. But you couldn't miss the fact that they're from the same family. Albert too. Jimmy is a different guy. He was much more of in a way, a sort of aggressive musician. I mean, putting together a big band at, you know, in his early 20s, and leading it with the kinds of guys that he had, Coltrane, Benny Golson, Johnny Coles, all these great players. And then he was playing alto at the time, and he went to New York to play with Dizzy, with Coltrane. And both Coltrane and Heath played altos in Dizzy's group. And I don't know how or who gave it to him, if it was a critic or other musicians, but he started getting known as Little Bird because, well, you know, it was an affectionate thing. It was like calling Roy Eldridge Little Jazz. He's a lovable guy. Everybody liked him, and he played alto, and he loved Charlie Parker, and so, but I think that, you know, Jimmy also had a lot of pride, and he didn't want to be known as Little Anybody. So 1952, I think it was, when he was playing with Miles, he switched to tenor. And that was really interesting because you could see that he came out of the tenor style of that period, Dexter Gordon and those kinds of players, especially Dexter, but he had his own tone. And like Percy, his pitch is just never in question. And you know, total professional taste. He just had all the attributes. And at the same time, he started writing tunes. And they were good tunes. They were really distinctive tunes. They were bebop tunes, but they didn't have the same rhythms, the same triplet infused. He didn't write tunes like that. So Miles started playing him. CTA, I think, was the first one. He wrote a tune called Gingerbread Boy, that, you know, it's sort of has a rocking ba-da-da-da-da-da. The vamp alone was fascinating, and you could play that tune so many different ways. But the tune itself forced you into a certain kind of rhythmic feeling that broke with the predictability of, say, bebop rhythms. He had done all this arranging, he had all this background, which for a while seemed to be going to waste until he started getting his own record sessions. And then he made that series for Riverside, which, you know, I thought were underrated. They never got the sales they should have. Even today, I don't think people know them the way they should. But every one of those records he made, you know, the Big Thumper, all those great tunes he wrote, the way he wrote for brasses to back himself up, the way he combined instruments, the way he got all the guys on the band to play at their absolute best, the way he himself as a soloist, you know, never took more than anybody else on the record. I mean, his average solo was 2 choruses, 3 choruses. He makes his statement, he's out of there. Beautiful sound. He worked again with Miles in '59 when Coltrane left. He filled in for a while when Coltrane was still there. Then when Coltrane was out, Miles had him in there briefly. If he'd been able to stay, it might have changed his career. But Jimmy's another one of those guys who went from the musician that everybody always referred to as the most underrated guy in jazz, like Kenny Dorham. He's a great player, great writer. Why isn't he a star? And then suddenly one day he woke up and he was a living legend, you know, Jimmy Heath. Audiences cheer, people, you know, they've heard of him. He comes out at a concert, you know, at a JVC type jazz festival or something, and it's a big deal. Never had a hit record, never did any of those kinds of things, but he persevered. He became a great educator. For a while, he had a wonderful band in the mid-'60s with Art Farmer. And somehow they got a contract with Columbia, and they made a lovely album called The Time and the Place. But this was the period when jazz was soon to be on its uppers. The avant-garde was creating a lot of noise, but nobody was really buying the records, and the Beatles had changed the dynamic of the record industry, and so every recording contract by a jazz artist was basically a one-shot, two-shot at best. And as I said before, the jazz-centric labels were all on the sales block, and they weren't being replaced. The whole industry seemed to be moving towards the monopolies that we have now. And they were own distribution, so it was impossible to start up anything then. And Jimmy, he would get grants. He wrote a famous piece called The African American Suite of Evolution, which had a piece in it that most of the music, I think he decided wasn't as good as it should have been, but there was one episode about Coleman Hawkins that he rewrote later, and became the voice of the saxophone became a important big band arrangement. He started teaching, I think he was 11 years at Queens College. He had taught before at Connecticut and a couple other schools, but at Queens he really became full-time master teacher. And he did amazing things there. I mean, he put together a student orchestra, which is maybe the best student orchestra in the country, certainly one of them, one that people really talked about. And he knew how to encourage young musicians. He knew how to get them play. He's so easy, so accessible. I think he just relaxed everybody. Frequently young people are so intimidated by jazz. They think it's so complicated, so difficult to master. And Jimmy Heath, you know, it's like the way he plays. Somebody once pointed out to me, I was at the Vanguard, and he was, I guess it was when the Heath brothers first started up, and somebody said to me, look at his fingers. They never rise off the keys. There's no effort. It's like total, you know, he's completely one with the instrument. Never shows off anything. In those days, a lot of musicians were doing knee bends when they played, and they were doing all kinds of showbiz things. Never. And he added soprano sax and flute. Excuse me. And he just, you know, he listened to everybody. He listened to Coltrane. I remember going to a recording session. I was just out of college. He had made a record called The Gap Sealer. And I had just started writing, and I reviewed it in Downbeat. I gave it 5 stars. It was his first record as a leader in a long time. It's a wonderful record if you can find it. And so now he was back in the studio to make a follow-up called Love and Understanding. And because I'd written that review, I guess, they called me and asked me to do the liner notes. So I came to the session, and it was a real education to see the way he worked. And he'd written a tune called Smilin' Billy for Billy Higgins, and we had lunch to you know, talk about the music. I'd never really spent that much time talking to a musician of his stature before, except as an undergraduate. And it was, you know, it was very positive to me to see a guy who was so completely devoted to the music, who just wasn't paying attention to all of the commercial problems that he had to face. But one of the things I remember at the session was that he had listened a lot to Coltrane, who had just passed on, and he was doing a little bit of squealing on that, in the best sense. I mean, they were high notes, but they were very musical. They were notes that you could find on the staff. You wouldn't mark them with an X. You could mark them on the right place on the staff. And there were some people at the session, older critics, who hated the avant-garde and everything it stood for, and they would be, you know, well, you know, he does some of that, but he makes it musical. Well, you know, the fact is that Jimmy was very much feeling what was going on at that time, and he was feeling the, you know, the wanting to sort of burst out of confines. And at the same time, I remember he introduced an arrangement on In a Sentimental Mood with a cello backing. Very musical, very on top of things. Great player, just a gorgeous player. Infallible, like his brother, on all the areas where it counts. Taste, timbre, you know, pitch, tone, everything. And after teaching for 11 years, it's an indication that they founded a Jimmy Heath seat, their chair of music. And then, while he was doing that, I don't remember who first told me, but somebody said, you know, Jimmy's playing his old arrangements and he's writing new ones. And these kids are playing them. And I thought, wow, Jimmy's writing big band arrangements. And I called up John Lewis. And we just instantly said, we got to do a concert of Jimmy Heath's music. So I called him. He was, you know, delighted at the idea to hear a crack orchestra playing these things. I said, you're going to conduct. John wouldn't even consider conducting. It had to be, you know, it's Jimmy's music, Jimmy's conducting. And it was one of those, the moment of truth was always the first rehearsal when the music was passed around. And because some of these guys were so sarcastic, and, you know, they could really give, you know, you didn't want to be around if it was your music when they were first looking at it. But it was like when they saw Benny Carter's charts. It was like, wow, what a pleasure, what a professional. The music was so beautifully written so that you could read it. You know, some guys made chicken marks on the score, not Jimmy. And it, as a lot of guys said, it played itself. You just, you felt like playing as soon as you saw the scores. By the end of the first rehearsal, everybody felt that they had the music down. And Jimmy is modest to a fault, as I've often said. He doesn't play his own tunes as much as he ought to. And he didn't give himself as many solos we thought, but as the evening wore on, he started feeling more and more confident, and he was playing more solos. And the audience loved it. The audience loved it. And this is one of the things I do not understand about jazz. I've been at so many events like that where the audience cheers and screams and they all walk out with smiles on their faces, and you wonder, do 10 of them go out and then buy a record by the guy? It never seems to translate into the kinds of commercial sales that make a career really possible, which is why most jazz musicians end up, it becomes a live art for them, and a lot of them record just so that they can get into the club circuit, just so that they can have a calling card. Sometimes they sell their own records at the gig. But you know, Jimmy's always has some of his records in print, and there isn't any Jimmy Heath record that you would regret buying. The first big band record he made after that concert, I thought that one was a little disappointing because it was a different orchestra and they weren't rehearsed enough. Didn't quite have the spark, but then he made up with that in the following one. And the records he makes as a saxophonist, he surprised me the other day when he said his audiences request the soprano more than the tenor. I would have thought it was the opposite, excuse me. But on the other hand, he's one of the very few soprano players who always plays that instrument in tune, and always with tremendous taste. That Round Midnight he played for the NYU students, it was just lovely. What a lesson that was in proportion, the way the solo followed from the tune. You can always, the great jazz soloists, they're not intimidating because you can follow what they're doing. You don't have to be a music student to understand it. And I think that applies to any style of the music, from traditional to avant-garde. There's a logic to what they play. I never asked him that, but my guess has to be Dexter Gordon. I think the longer you go back in his recording career, the more Dexter you hear. I think there had to be some Gene Ammons. I'm sure, the times when he was right next to Coltrane, I think Coltrane wasn't playing tenor as much as alto, so Coltrane had a huge influence on him. He had an influence on everyone, and you can hear that in his 60s recordings. But I think Dexter was the key figure. But I remember one night going to the Vanguard to hear Arnett Cobb, and I was sitting with Jimmy. Jimmy was there set after set. He loved Arnett Cobb. And he said, Arnett Cobb never plays a lick. He said, listen, and you'll see I'm right. And it's true. He plays grunts and groans and strange notes and all kinds of configurations, but he never played a cliche. He never played, just a standard jazz riff. And that really tickled him. And I think he's very much alive to that, to the way that you get around playing the obvious. Benny Golson, I imagine, may have had some influence. He was in the band, and their styles are not completely dissimilar. Benny has a lighter sound. Jimmy has, I think, a deeper and warmer sound. But I think that part of that is that in addition to Dexter, he was also very conscious of the players who came before him. A lot of the bebop players in the first generation retained certain elements of the swing players that the lesser beboppers did not. Jimmy is one of those guys who has that big fat sound that the older guys developed, partly because the style of music allowed them to, but also because it was part of their signature. And if you were playing in a band and you were broadcasting, you wanted people to know who you were, because the radio guy wasn't going to say. And but it's like we said about Percy. It's also, ultimately, it's not about influence. It's a reflection of who you are, wherever you came from in terms of your playing. It always becomes ultimately about who you are. Louis Armstrong's famous line, "Jazz is what you are." And Percy and Jimmy, both of them, are really sweet-natured guys. They're funny. They are generous, extremely generous to other musicians, to other people. And there is that generosity in their playing. And in Jimmy's playing, you always feel that, you're there to have a good time, and so is he. And I think one of the reasons he doesn't play his own tunes enough is because he just thinks that the audience is going to feel more comfortable if they hear something by Monk or a standard. But, you know, the other night when he played Prince Albert, Kenny Dorham's tune, you know, he played that tune. That's a difficult line. He played it as though he's played it every night for years and years and years, which he probably has to some degree, but he also played it with such warmth and feeling. Same thing with Round Midnight. You know, when I hear somebody's going to play Round Midnight, I grab for my pistol, because Round Midnight is the most overplayed piece ever, and you wonder why they, you know, but a great musician will pull something out of it that will compel your attention. And he did on soprano. You know, he did. Kept your interest every frame, every measure.